He's a prolific author and broadcaster. And I would have hoped that many of you would have known him from those media. His talk today is called Control, the Dark History and Troubling Present of Eugenics. It also happens to be the title of his latest book, but I think that's just coincidence.
Entirely coincidental.
Adam.
Thank you. Totally coincidental. I really didn't know what to call it, so I thought I'd just cash in. And it's available in the bookshop just across the road. Thank you. Well, I come to this last, and so I have the privilege of saying whatever I like, and you can't answer back. I also haven't timed this talk, so it may go on for several hours. There's going to be some overlap with Rachel's excellent talk just then. Sort of, you know, the Venn diagrams of us. There is an overlapping space. Is there a window for Venn anywhere in this building at all? I knew that. Anyway, I thought the last couple of days have been exceptional. I've really enjoyed it. I think everyone has. I've learned a lot. It has fulfilled the Rethian values of the BBC in being informative, educational, and entertaining, some of it. And it's Friday, and you know, we're all desperate to go to the pub, so I'm going to bring you right down and end on a real downer as well. I've been writing about the history of race science and eugenics within the context of the evolution of genetics and biology for the last few years, and much of that has been based around the works of key protagonists in the development of biology in the modern synthesis. I was an undergraduate in the Galton department in the 1990s, and that was subsumed into the biology department in the 2000s, and that is now the department that I am a lecturer in. And as such, that department is a direct descendant of the Eugenics Records Office, which was founded by Francis Galton. Now, one of the reasons, of course, why we're talking about this now is because we are in this era of reassessing our intellectual forebears and their political views and their actions, and the time of carte blanche for the celebration of people whose views significantly deviate from our current mores is, I think, over. And we at UCL have a peculiar history in relation to eugenics. Hello. And there he is. There's the old bastard. Francis Galton founded the Eugenics Records Office at UCL in 1904, having developed the ideas from the 1960s onwards, the first major work being Hereditary Genius in 1969. And Galton left a significant chunk of money in his will, primarily for the Galton Professorship and the development of eugenics at UCL. There he is with Carl Pearson, who was at Galton's behest the first Galton professor. Now, of course, R.A. Fisher was the second. And much of the work of early genetics and the modern synthesis was done at UCL. I understand that Cambridge may have played a supporting role in that, I'm not sure. But it cannot be denied that UCL also played host to much of the significant British work in the development of the scientific framework of eugenics. And that begins with Galton, who acted as a figurehead for the development of eugenics here in the US, in Germany, and in the Global South, as we just heard from Rachel there. That work was carried on by Pearson and by Fisher, and politically by people like Mary Stopes and others who are all significant players in the history of University College London. Now, in 2018, UCL launched an internal inquiry, the first, into its history of eugenics. I gave testimony to that. It concluded just before the pandemic started in 2020. I found much of that process to be disappointing in its scholarship and its process. Nevertheless, one of the outcomes was that the names of both Galton and Pearson were to be removed and have been removed from UCL's buildings, and the not insignificant funds that had been bequeathed to UCL by Galton, including funding the Galton Chair, would be reallocated. So in 2020, following on from that, in the summer, my department, GEE, internally and autonomously decided to rename the R.A. Fisher Centre to the UCL Centre for Computational Biology, though the Fisher Professorship, which is currently held by Ziheng Yang, that still stands. Now, we've been teaching the history of eugenics and race science at UCL for many decades. Anecdotally, I think we are unusual in that regard, and for obvious reasons, because so much of it happened under our auspices. But in the last few years, I've seen a change in that process around the world. I've shared my slides, my resources, and given lectures in genetics and anthropology departments all around the world. Partly because of the pandemic, you can do that much more easily over Zoom. But that has happened at a far greater frequency in the last few years than I can recall. Mostly it seems because genetics lecturers around the world who teach the history of their subject don't have the space in their courses to talk about this pernicious history, which was foundational to the subject of genetics and evolutionary biology. Next year, I'm writing a whole new course, which is biology and society, and we're crafting much more space to discuss these types of topics. I was taught about Galton and Pearson in the very first weeks of the Introduction to Genetics course at UCL in 1993. That was taught by Steve Jones then. Steve still teaches on that same course, but I now teach the eugenics and race sections of that. It is not without irony that my salary is paid for by the Galton Restitution Fund, something that I find quite amusing, although I doubt whether Galton would. Although I should say, this is actually the codicil to Galton's will, in which he specifies the terms of the Galton professorship. And I don't know whether you can read that, but it says that we'll collect materials bearing on eugenics, discuss such materials and draw conclusions, form a central office to provide information, blah, 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 professorial instruction, occasional publications, occasional public lectures. I would wager that we do pretty much all of those things. So we continue to fulfill Galton's remit, even though the conclusions that we're drawing and the lectures that we're teaching are pretty much diametrically opposed to his intentions. I think that's the process of science. It strives to remove personal biases and prejudices from our understanding of reality. Now, briefly, let me talk about Fisher, because I haven't mentioned him much yet, and I'm not going to mention him much in the rest of the talk. We've heard a lot about Fisher's interest in eugenics, and it is very well documented. And yesterday from Alex Elwood, we heard about the eugenics chapters in the genetical theory. It was a lifelong interest, as we heard. It stemmed from his days here as an undergraduate and persisted through his life. Now, in that regard, I don't think Fisher was particularly unusual in holding those types of views. I don't suppose, or maybe there is, but there are conversations about changing the name of the Arthur Balfour Chair that Anne currently holds, or perhaps renaming Churchill College. Is that a discussion that is happening in it is? Okay, well, good for you. The Mary Stopes clinics did change their names last year and now called MSI. And with us here at Keys, the specific charges against Fisher in this context, in the discussion of the removal of his memorial window, pivot on some key points, which I'm just going to address briefly. Now, you heard Robert Proctor talk about the Nazi scientist Ottmar Freiherr von Fischer this morning. Let me talk a little bit about him. That is him on the right doing some of his twin studies work, which is one of the aspects of his work that so impressed Fisher and also came up in the discussion of cigarettes and smoking this morning. Twin studies, incidentally, invented by Francis Galton in 1884. Now, Fischer was a Nazi. He was a member of the Nazi Party from 1940. He'd written a great deal in the pre-war era in support of scientific racism, biologically racial categories, including a not insignificant amount of work, which is somewhat incoherent, but is demonstrating a robust anti-Semitism, which is not atypical for that time. During the war, we know he worked with tissues and data from people murdered in Auschwitz. He was, as mentioned by Robert Proctor, the supervisor of Joseph Mengele, though I think it should be stated that Mengele's notoriety was not well known outside of Nazi historians and historians of in the 1940s and 50s, and I think it's unlikely that Fisher had ever heard of his name. Jenny Bangham alluded yesterday to the fact that some of his work was funded by the Rockefeller Foundation. Indeed, for sure, was also funded by Rockefeller from 1932 in Berlin. Now, that is the context for who for sure was. That is not an attempt to besmirch Fisher's name via guilt by association, which has been part of the discussions that we've been having in the run-up to this meeting. The two of them did correspond before the war. Fisher was impressed by his reputation and scientific credentials, particularly about twin studies. They met. He came to London after the war. At Fisher's request, Fisher offered reputational support to Fisher as he attempted to reinvent himself, as many of the Nazi eugenicists did in the wake of the Holocaust. I didn't know the thing about Fisher recruiting or attempting to recruit Fisher to the cigarette program. So I'm delighted to learn that in the lecture this morning, which I thought was absolutely terrific. I recommend to all of you, you read Walter Bodmer's recent paper in Heredity and lots of the stuff that Anthony Edwards has written about Fisher. I've had productive interactions with several of the fellows of Caius before this meeting, notably Malcolm Smith, who's done quite a lot of work in producing a summary of some of Fisher's key correspondence around the subject of Fisher. Of eugenics. There were many over the years. This one is from 1907 in a lecture. This is actually co-authored by Pearson. And of course, inherent to this is the separation of, well, nature and nurture, the innate and the environmental, what we would now call genes or DNA and the non-genetic environment. And that nature and nurture, nature versus nurture, that was a phrase coined by Galton himself. It's not versus. I mean, I wish he hadn't done that. That's really plagued genetics for the next 100 years or so. We also think that it might be possibly inspired by Prospero's lament for Caliban in The Tempest, a born devil on whose nurture can never stick. But of course, for the eugenicists, the nature aspect of that equation is much more important. The inherent, the innate, the genetic, even though this is in the era of pre-genetics, it tends to overwhelm the environmental. That is the hereditarian approach, and Galton is the first hereditarian. He had a model of society that eugenics would be applied to for the improvement of the stock of the British people, in which you see a large, respectable working class, and that you have a smaller hegemonic power structure at the top and undesirables at the bottom. And the positive eugenics was to enhance, by incentivization, the people at the top end of society, and negative eugenics was to remove people from the bottom end of society. Now, of course, all of this relies inherently on grading people, on creating ranks for people, which is something that Galton begins to do in Hereditary Genius and then continues to do throughout his life. It's fundamental to the idea of eugenics that some people have qualities which are desirable, which means that some people have qualities which are less desirable. That's the next slide. The social context for the emergence of this is a post-Malthusian society, an era of huge societal change, industrialization in Victorian Britain, urbanization, a more visible poor. The poor laws, the Tudor poor laws are being repealed. There's an increase in institutionalization. There's the transfer of the care of lower socioeconomic groups to the state. We've got immigration from the empire. Fashionable declinism. I don't know whether fashionable is useful there as a term. Declinism seems to be a permanent feature of all societies, even though we still haven't declined out of existence. And then there's the context of scientific racism, which is inherent to the eugenics project, particularly in the characterization of non-white people and the hierarchy of the pseudoscientific races. And also this notion that people were being replaced, that indigenous populations or ruling powerful populations were being replaced by others. As a result of thinking about positive and negative selection and ranking people in different orders, you inevitably start, or the eugenics projects inevitably start by saying, these are the people that we want to reproduce more, and these are the people that we want to reproduce less, and can be coerced or forced into reproducing less through sterilization later into the 20th century. But of course, in every case where eugenics has been enacted or fantasized about, the categories become very broad and very nebulous very quickly. And so it starts with people who have specific diseases, things like Huntington's or Mongolism there. Like previous speakers, I'm going to use terminology that was from the time. Non-specific disabilities, non-specific pseudo-psychiatric diagnoses such as feeble-mindedness, racialized groups, more so in America than here. And then it becomes women with menstrual problems. It becomes alcoholics, epileptics, iterant criminals, people we don't like, and the Jews. It always ends up with the Jews. Okay, now that's a slide that we've just seen in the previous talk. There'll be some overlap here. But what I want to talk about the cultural ubiquity of eugenics during this period. It is an idea which is widely supported across society. It becomes an idea which is so appealing in the late Victorian and early Edwardian period that there is broad political support across the political spectrum, this being an advert for better genes. There's tons of examples of this throughout culture, throughout various aspects of our cultural lives. This one is my absolute favorite. This is a Valentine's card, a eugenics Valentine's card. How romantic. Here's an example of some people who are on both ends of the political spectrum. I asked my students to name any of these 5 people, and the results are always really disappointing. Does anyone? I mean, it's foolish to do that, but who are those two top left? Very good. Someone else. No. That's not Balfour. Oh no, that is Balfour. Sorry, I changed it a minute ago. That's meant to be Teddy Roosevelt. I'll come on to Roosevelt in a minute. 5 out of 5, well done. It's also eugenics, a project associated with first wave feminism. Mary Stopes, best known now for her her clinics that champion the reproductive rights of women, was an active and enthusiastic eugenicist. She was also a fright. I mean, a real horror story of a person. Her interest in reproductive rights of women was primarily so that she could enforce the sterilisation of Irish in London, and indeed she wrote poetry, love poetry, and sent it to Hitler as late as 1938. And Mary Stopes' clinics are now called MSI, and you can see why. There's Beveridge. In his early days, he expressed enthusiastic support for eugenics as well, and as we heard much later, read the work of Fisher. Churchill, I think, was probably, arguably, the most enthusiastic political supporter for eugenics. He proposed and wrote often about ideas that are fundamentally eugenic in their genesis. He proposed compulsory sterilisation of the feeble-minded multiple times in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, including drafting early legislation which never made it to Parliament. 1912, he proposed using the newly discovered Röntgen rays, we call them X-rays. They were discovered in 1896 to sterilise men and women. And in earlier drafts of what became the Mental Deficiency Act, which was passed in 1913, included compulsory sterilisation in that, but they weren't in the final version. And they weren't in the final version due mostly to the campaigning of a small number of people, one of whom was G.K. Chesterton, someone who comes out of this story relatively clean, a devout Catholic, a Christian apologist, and a lifelong in opposition to eugenics. He wrote a book called Eugenics and Other Evils, if that doesn't make clear what his views were about it. And I think he does, in his writings on eugenics, identify one of the fundamental problems with eugenics as an ideology, which is that it was incredibly nebulous about who was to be targeted. And ultimately, it was people in lower socioeconomic status, the poor. And that ran counter to his views as a Catholic, although the church more broadly was very divided, as it was on many of these types of issues. And the Reverend Inga, the Dean of St. Paul's, wrote many times in favor of eugenics, which, I don't know, I find it difficult to compute now, but them's the breaks. Now that is Roosevelt. Of course, I don't know how Balfour got in earlier. So I want to switch over to America, but the fact that we never had eugenics policy or enforced sterilisation policy as a result of G.K. Chesterton campaigning, and particularly campaigning Josiah Wedgwood and Wedgwood filibustering in 1912, is, I think it's very British that we invent things, export them around the world, and then turn out to be not very good at enforcing them. I'm thinking mostly about cricket when I say that. But we never had an actual enforced sterilisation eugenics policy in this country, whereas many countries, maybe 30, did around the world, as we've heard from Rachel in the previous talk, and I'm going to concentrate on two others, the next one being the United States. Roosevelt, post-presidency, expresses enthusiasm for eugenics in 1912 in a letter to Charles Davenport, and I'll come on to talk about him in just a minute. Back to that cultural context for the emergence of eugenics slide, I just want to focus briefly on this final point. The idea that people are being replaced, that indigenous people or people who exist in a society are being replaced by others. That is very central to the eugenics of America at this period of time. Here's two characters or two cultural artifacts which I think are worth mentioning. Kellogg's, who invented the cornflake with his brother, this is John Harvey Kellogg, invented the cornflake with his brother in the 1890s, was a super weird man, obsessed with racial superiority, obsessed with eugenics, used them, millions he made from cornflakes. Cornflakes, by the way, were invented to suppress the libido of young American men because he felt very strongly about protecting their vital fluids is one of the ways that he phrased it. The reason that cornflakes don't have sugar or salt in them is because John Harvey Kellogg believed that any flavors, including coffee and cinnamon, would create sexual desire in young men, and they would therefore spill their seed. John Harvey split from William Kellogg, his brother, the co-founder, the co-creator of the cornflake, because William wanted to add sugar to cornflakes, and that's why we have Frosties. So, I mean, there aren't many light touches in this subject, but I think that is quite funny. He was a man obsessed with sex who boasted that he had never consummated his 30-year marriage and had a daily enema. Normally that gets a better laugh. Anyway, he founded the Race Betterment Foundation with his millions from breakfast cereals and including support from Charles Davenport in 1906, and it was a eugenics establishment. Now, The Great Gatsby, one of the great works of the Western canon, one of the great American novels, is a book which has eugenics as a central theme that runs through it from about the third page. And I've read that book several times, and I love it. And I hadn't really noticed this until my most recent reading in the last few years, where Tom Buchanan says in his stupidly brash way, that's the quote, "If we don't look out, the white race will be utterly subsumed." It's a scientific fact, he says. Now, he's quoting a fictional book called The Rise of the Coloured Empires by a fictional scientist called Goddard in the book. And this is a very thinly veiled reference to 2 or 3 of the major American eugenicists of the time. One of them is H.H. Goddard, and I'm going to talk about him in just a sec. The title of the fictional book riffs off The Rising Tide of Colour, The Threat Against White World Supremacy by Lothrop Stoddard, and also The Passing of the Great Race by Madison Grant. The Passing of the Great Race by Madison Grant was a 2016, sorry, no, it wasn't. It was a 1916 book, which is absolutely bonkers and awful, and is one of 2 American authors cited in Mein Kampf by Hitler. In it, Madison Grant asserts that the great civilizations of Egypt, Rome, and Greece were seeded by alpine Nordic Northmen who had come down, created their families, and then retreated into the woods in the north. This was a huge bestseller in 1916 and influential in the developing eugenics movement, to the extent that it is something that is effectively cited in The Great Gatsby. But it's all part of that formulation that our people are being threatened with replacement. It becomes formalized as great replacement theory in 1918. And that continues in right-wing politics to this day, and the neo-fascism and neo-Nazism that we are seeing expressed all around the world, but specifically there in Charlottesville in 2017, where those guys chanted, "The Jews will not replace us." It's never quite clear whether they mean that they will be replaced by Jews or that the Jews are orchestrating a replacement of their people. I find it mildly amusing that this chap can no longer get employment. Now, back to history. I'm going to focus on these three characters who are significant players in the development of eugenics in the US. Charles Davenport on the left, Harry Laughlin in the middle, and Herbert Goddard on the right. We start with Davenport because he really is central to the development of eugenics in the US. He's, I guess, equivalent to Galton. He met Galton in the 1990s in London. Davenport was a biologist, a developmental zoologist at Harvard, did his PhD there, and then moved to become an adjunct professor at Chicago. Met Galton and was inspired by Galton's eugenics writings and beliefs, and took them back to America, where he eventually went to Cold Spring Harbor and set up the Eugenics Records Office. That was funded by three organizations primarily, one of which was Rockefeller, one of which was Carnegie, and the third was by Mary Harriman. Mary Harriman was the widow of the railroad tycoon E.L. Harriman, who had died a few years earlier, so she was a multi-millionaire. And she was fundamentally interested in eugenics via her daughter, who was also called Mary Harriman, who was so interested in ideas of eugenics that she was nicknamed Eugenia at her university, at her college. And she knew no, she didn't. She knew F. Scott Fitzgerald. So the connection there is all this East Coast set up on Westport and Long Island, and this is where F. Scott Fitzgerald gets his inspiration for many of his characters and much of the eugenics theme in Gatsby. There aren't one-to-one comparisons, there aren't individual characters who can be identified, but there's a very clear strand of these are the types of people that Fitzgerald and his wife Zelda were hanging out with, and they make it into Gatsby as characters who are absolutely central in developing US eugenics movements, specifically through the building and the funding, the continued funding until the 1930s of the Eugenics Records Office in Cold Spring Harbor. This is it. This is a report from the New York Times in 1912, and you can see from that headline that it is that mixture, that fusion of the basic science with the politics, that social problems have a basis in heredity. And fundamentally, that's what the ERO was interested in sorting out. They had two objectives. One was to really spread the word of eugenics and enable eugenics legislation to be spat out in states across America. But also what they wanted to do is collect family trees. They wanted to collect family trees of everyone in America such that they could identify the flow of genes through generations in the relatively recently discovered Mendelian way, such that they could suggest that certain characteristics were subject to eugenic positive or negative selection. So they were all bound to this very Mendelian idea that complex characters, complex traits, or simple characters, traits and diseases would follow this Mendelian pattern of inheritance, and if they had pedigrees big enough, that they could follow them through the American population, and therefore eugenics could be imposed upon them. So the Eugenics Records Office was exactly that. They went out to all around the country and asked people to fill out forms, which they would do particularly at places like county state fairs or agricultural fairs. The first one was in Kansas in 1907, and where they'd engage with farming folk, so working class people, and this was very deliberate as well because there was a perception that this was a top-down approach from academics and politicians and intellectuals, and actually they weren't engaging the working classes. But there was a continuing theme through the eugenics movements from its inception, which is that if organisms can be bred through agriculture, then why can't humans? And that's exactly the model that they would use, taking to these agricultural fairs, where they would have fitter family contests or better baby contests, and people would be asked to fill out forms which gave genealogical information and some health information, and in reward for that, they would be given a trinket or, in some cases, a badge, or they would be entered into competitions for which there would be prizes. I think that's an interesting data gathering model, and it's one that effectively is paralleled or mirrored by what 23andMe do today, which is that you pay for something, for a bit of scientific information which is of, I think, trivial value and mostly can be determined by asking a couple of questions and looking at you. And in return, 23andMe own your data, unless you opt out. And from that, they can, well, do what they want. They can sell on your most private, personal genomic information to create drugs, which then get sold back to you, which is a sort of very impressive end-state capitalism type state of affairs. But the ERO were doing it for different purposes back then, in the first decades of the Edwardian period. This is a picture from CSL, from the Cold Spring Harbor. This is what the records actually looks like. And, sorry, I've just lost my place briefly. And that is a picture of a training class. So there is Davenport sitting on the front right, and I think that's Lachlan too on the far right there. And so they're training people, including particularly women, to go out into these state fairs in order to harvest all of this information as best they can. Now, the result of that, Rachel alluded to this, is that the United States had eugenics, statewide eugenics policies in 31 states at its maximum. The first was Arizona in 1907. This is from 1913, and you can see that the development of eugenics in various states. So again, this is actually happening. We estimate, it's difficult to estimate accurately, we estimate between 70 and 80,000 people were sterilized involuntarily, sometimes against their knowledge or will, during the course of the 20th century. And the reason we're still talking about this today is because it is ongoing. Not in the same numbers, but sterilizations, forced sterilizations in ICE detention centers happened last year. There are ongoing class actions in Canada for hundreds of women, mostly indigenous women or First Nations women, who were sterilized against their will. This is an ongoing, although the numbers are much smaller, it is an ongoing project in America. And it's closely associated with psychiatry as well. The development of eugenics is very closely associated with medicine, particularly psychiatry. The terms that we use, which have become casual insults to us today, had pseudo-psychiatric associations with them. And this is coincident with the birth and the utility of IQ as a metric of cognitive abilities. This is a demonstration in New York a few years later, which conveys the same sorts of idea. I cannot read this sign. By what right have I children? Don't know how he wrote the sign. And it all is predicated, again, on that Davenport-Mendelian axis idea of what we might call monogenic determinism, that complex behaviors exist in pedigrees and can be passed from generation to generation in a way that if we have a pedigree big enough, we can map and therefore deal with. Now, I think I spend most of my work talking to broad publics about genetics. And I think this is an idea which has persisted and persists to this day. The idea that complex characters can be encoded in single genes and that there has a biological essentialism to them, and we see it all the time. Less so today, less so in the 2020s, but 10 years ago when we were still in the sort of rich period, the gold rush period of discovering human genes and variants in human genes and genome-wide association studies, when we were discovering them hand over fist, the headlines in the newspapers would repeatedly describe how scientists have discovered the gene for X, where X is a complex trait. There's a sample from across the press, gene that makes you good at taking risky decisions, the happiness gene. The middle three, all from the Daily Mail, a gene that can scare you out of your mind, a gene that makes you lean to the left politically, and the love cheat gene, 1 in 4 born to be unfaithful, claim scientists. Interestingly, that's all the same gene. So, imagine having that phenotype. The Atlantic went with a gene that will predict what time of day you'll die. I've got no idea how that works. And as recently as 2016, Scientific American, very august Scientific American, even in the era where we know that there are dozens, if not hundreds of genes which cumulatively play a small role in the heritability of complex disorders such as schizophrenia, Scientific American chose to go with the headline schizophrenia gene discovery. At least they had the good grace to put it in scare quotes. Now, this idea, this monogenic determinism, is fundamental to the development of eugenics in the United States. Started and pursued by Davenport, but spreads all through the eugenics movement in the States. And I want to talk about the third of these three, which is Herbert Goddard. Herbert Goddard is an interesting fellow and very significant in this story, but in other stories in science as well. He's the first person to translate the first IQ tests. So developed in France by Simon and Binet, he brings them to America, translates them into English, and applies the first IQ tests, which develop into the Stanford IQ test, and it's the foundation of IQ testing in America. It's the same test that he writes that gets used at Ellis Island to test immigrants for cognitive abilities. He's also the person who introduces the word moron to describe people of an IQ of between 51 and 70. He categorizes imbecile as people with an IQ of between 26 and 50, and idiot as those below 25. Now, that's all just background to who Goddard was. The story that I'm interested in telling here, and now I'm on the trajectory towards the home straight here, is it concerns this woman here. This is Deborah Kallikak. Now, those pedigrees are incredibly important at this time as part of the Eugenics Records Office whole work. Rachel mentioned the Buck versus Bell case, which is one of the iconic families, but there were others, and I think the Kallikaks are one of the most significant. Goddard was treating the 8-year-old Deborah Kallikak. He described her as a high-grade, feeble-minded person, the moron, the delinquent, the kind of girl or woman that fills our reformatories. Now, in treating Deborah Kallikak, he decided that the approach was to track as best he could the family tree, the Kallikak family tree, in order to establish whether her feeble-mindedness flowed through the family in the way that would be predicted by Mendelian genetics. And so he did a comprehensive family tree, which went all the way back many generations and identified as many people as he could on this family tree, starting with Martin Kallikak. And Martin Kallikak was a returning Civil War hero who, on his way back to his Quaker upstanding wife, he stopped off at a bar and impregnated what he described as a feeble-minded but attractive barmaid, who he never saw ever again. And what Goddard established was that at this point, the family bifurcates into the upstanding Quaker family of his wife, which is filled with bankers and educated people and scientists and religious people, and generally an upstanding, successful family. But on the barmaid's side, it was full of miscreants and feeble-minded people and people with terrible psychiatric and physical diseases, beset by poverty. And Deborah Kallikak was the last in that line with her feeble-mindedness. And this he wrote up in a book called The Kallikak Family, which was published in 1912, which was an international bestseller and profoundly influential on our thinking about complex psychiatric disorders, their relationship to monogenic determinism or Mendelian inheritance, and the eugenics movement. This is a textbook, psychology textbook from 1955, and you can see this cartoon that represents the work from 30 years earlier. There's Martin Kallikak. He dallied with a feeble-minded tavern girl, it says here, and you can see all of the old horror children that she had and all the fine, upstanding Quaker children that they had on the other side. Now, that's the Kallikak story not quite complete. I'm going to jump across to 1912 in the UK now, because in 1912, in the Cecil Hotel on the Strand, the first International Eugenics Conference was held in July. So this was organized, it was co-chaired by Churchill. The plenary speech, the Saturday dinner speech was given by Arthur Balfour. All of the major players in eugenics from around the world were there, including Davenport and Harry Laughlin and Churchill and Reg Punnett were all there. Punnett gave one of the opening addresses. And Punnett is interesting for this, for specific reasons. There he is. He's in his presentation, we don't have a verbatim quote for it, but in his presentation where he's talking about feeble-mindedness and the inheritance of feeble-mindedness, he says specifically that we should express scientific caution about the number of traits for which we don't yet have detailed hereditary information. He said it was extremely limited, the amount of information we had for complex hereditary traits. And the first time I read that, I thought, yes. And then the next sentence was, except for feeble-mindedness, which is one on which we could act right away. Now, I don't know this, and this is a guess, and I'd love if there are some historians out there, or indeed the existing Balfour professor might have information on this. I think that what Punnett says in that talk is a recapitulation of what Goddard had said in the Kallikak book, which was published in 1912. This is in 1912. Maybe it's a bit close in time, but he is expressing exactly the same idea. I'd love to know if Punnett actually read the Kallikak book, and if we could find out, that would be, well, it would be a paper. He attributed that feeble-mindedness to single, and this is the direct quote, single Mendelian inheritance. Okay, so we've got this idea that is blossomed, that was born in the UK, it's blossomed in America in this particular way. And I don't need to point out to an audience like this that there are no single genes for complex traits or disorders. As I mentioned about schizophrenia, there are hundreds of genes involved with very small effect, small but cumulative effect, and that accounts for only a small proportion of the heritability of the diseases such as schizophrenia or whatever feeble-minded might have been. But not for these guys. It's a single gene. It flows through families in a Mendelian way that we can actually trace, and that includes Punnett saying that in front of the first and biggest eugenics conference in the world, in front of politicians, a former prime minister and a future prime minister. Now, not everyone was super into this. I said that there was widespread support on the political left and right, but it is true that there is resistance from scientists who don't agree with this, who don't agree that there is either evidence for this or that the evidence doesn't say this. Pearson is one of those. Pearson, whilst at the Galton Laboratory in Gower Street, writes 3 papers over the course of the first 2 decades of the 20th century, which heavily criticized the American model, saying that they don't have the data, that we don't see these Mendelian inheritance patterns. And the interesting thing is this doesn't in any way exonerate Pearson from being a terrible eugenicist and racist. He's complaining because he doesn't think their data is good enough to support the global eugenics movement and may indeed hamper it because their data is not very good. But nevertheless, they're expressing doubt of the principle that there's monogenic determinism that runs through families for specific psychiatric traits. Morgan, as well, expresses exactly the same thing a bit later, but very clearly is separating out the nurture from nature here and suggesting that the environment is important in a way that the eugenicists have not accounted for. He says at the end there, these effects may be, to a large extent, communicated rather than inherited, communicated meaning inherited in a non-genetic way. So you've got opposition to this idea, even though it's popular, even though it is a bit of science which we now know to be problematic and probably wrong, being talked about in the corridors of power in front of future and former prime ministers. None of that actually should matter because the Kallikak family never existed. Martin Kallikak was not a person, and in fact, that family was an entirely unrelated family descended from a man called John Wolverton. And John Wolverton, who is a 19th century son of Gabriel Wolverton and Catherine Murray, they were landowners, they had educated children, there were poor farmers and there were socioeconomic problems in their family over many generations, but there were also teachers, there were, in the 20th century, there were pilots, there were loads of bankers. They were not the miscreants, the undesirables that Goddard had found out. It wasn't, he made a mistake, and 10 years after this, he retracted the study, but the genie was out of the bottle. It was far too late. It was embedded as an idea, even though this family simply did not have the traits that they were describing. Stephen Jay Gould writes about this in one of his books in the 80s. The Kallikak book has a lot of photos in it, has a lot of photos of the children. And neither of these photos show this. But there's one photo, which I can't get a high-resolution version of, but would love to show you, where any clinical geneticist or undergraduate geneticist would look at and immediately say, that child has fetal alcohol syndrome, which is a very, very clear facial characteristic. And of course, fetal alcohol syndrome or fetal alcohol spectrum disorders are not genetically modulated at all. So this is an entirely socioeconomically constructed problem that has emerged in this family that was attributed to a genetic disorder. So the Kallikaks were fraudulent. It was a hugely influential, non-existent family. Okay. How long have I got? 6 minutes to do the whole of Nazi Germany. Right, let's do the development of eugenics in Germany. So Alfred Plötz is the equivalent of Galton in Germany. So he's born in a wealthy family in the 1860, and he's very science orientated. He's enamored by the works of Darwin, but also of Haeckel, and it starts off with a great passion for Teutonic folklore, but also socialist intentions. And he goes to work on a farm as a young man in Iowa, a socialist, a communal farm in Iowa. However, he discovers to his horror that, well, there's the quote, he comes back so disillusioned with the quality of the people on that farm that he returns to Germany and then is inspired by Galton and commits the rest of his life to developing eugenics policies in Germany. He writes a book in 1895, which is called The Excellence of Our Race and the Protection of the Weak. The protection of the weak is one of the ideas of eugenics, which is that if we protect weak people in society via vaccination, then we lower the overall quality of the stock of that people. In that, he coins the word Rassenhygiene, which is the eugenics policy of the Germans for the next 40 years or so. I'll just summarize some of the trajectory. I'm slightly embarrassed to be describing the development of Nazi policy and eugenics in German in front of Richard Evans, but you know, so it goes. Starting with Plötz, but developed with a number of other people, it is formulated with the idea of Nordic purity, that the German people are a discrete race and they are the best race, the most superior race, and therefore should be protected. Very interestingly, Plötz and other early protagonists, Fritz Lenz, Eugene Fischer, were not fundamentally anti-Semitic in this era, and in fact, in answer to one of the questions, which I think was from you, encouraged mating with that Nordic people should, the German people should mate with Jewish people because of their perceived academic and intellectual successes. It is only later, after the rise of Hitler in 1933, that they accept that the best way they're going to get their eugenics policies enacted is by also embracing the virulent anti-Semitism of Hitler himself. This idea of lives unworthy of life is first described in 1920. And we go back to the Americans here, because most of the development, or much of the development of eugenics policies and eugenics ideas in Germany were directly influenced by the eugenicists of the United States. It's clear intellectually, but it's also clear financially as well. Harry Laughlin, the middle character there, spent much time at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institutes in Germany, multiple Kaiser Wilhelm Institutes, and also Rockefeller funded the Darwin one in 1932. So there is this direct link between the eugenicists of Cold Spring Harbor and the development of the euthanasia and Rassenhygiene programs in Nazi Germany. Yeah, I said that. Oh, and the other thing that Laughlin did as well, in the 1920 in America, is that he was aware that development of state-by-state eugenics policies was becoming a bit disjointed. So he created a boilerplate, a template from which all states could then write their policy. And that was part of the genesis of some of the first legislation that Hitler passed in 1933, which become known as the Nuremberg laws, the laws for the prevention of hereditary illness in future generations. And they come directly from Laughlin and from the American eugenicists. They become enacted in 1933. January 1934 is when the first euthanasia or eugenics race and hygiene programs begin, and then in 1939 the infamous Axiom T4 is implemented. Now, just because I'm running out of time and I need to get on and we need to do questions, let me just briefly talk about, well, you know that the Nazis were adept propagandists, and this is, for example, a poster that was designed to normalize and to encourage the thinking about the prevention of hereditary illness laws. And this one's from 1936. They were also very interested in cinema. And Das Erbe is a short film, a 12-minute film that was published or released in 1935. And Das Erbe means broadly the inheritance. And in it, what happens is a young female researcher in a white coat, you can see her at the top right there, goes to see her professor because she's observed some stag beetles fighting with each other. And he sits her down and shows her a film which includes all of these examples of Darwinian struggles for existence, including there, the dog eating the hare, there's the stag beetles, there's various other, a cat hunting, and various other aspects of the struggle for life, that very Darwinian idea. And halfway through the film, she suddenly gets this, and they all fall about laughing because she says, I understand it. Nature, animals, have their own racial policies. They all think it's terribly funny. Now, immediately after, that's the shot from that. Immediately after, so I'm going to play a bit of this film. It lasts a couple of minutes. This is what happens next. Watch carefully.
Bei sämtlichen Vorfahren die gleich guten Eigenschaften. Guter Jäger, guter Jäger, guter Jäger.
He's talking about dog breeds here and how dog breeding has worked to create specific
Ja,
traits.
erst recht für uns Menschen.
Ja, dann würde die Gattenwahl manchmal anders ausfallen. Ein bekanntes Beispiel für die schrecklichen Folgen unüberlegten Handelns ist die amerikanische Familie Kallikak. Die Nachkommen des Leutnants Kallikak
So
aus
there's
seiner Ehe mit einer
Martin Kallikak at the
erbgesunden
top.
Frau waren alle gesund.
And these are the healthy, heritably healthy women on his Quakerist side of the family.
Kallikak hatte aber noch ein voreheliches Kind mit einer geistesschwachen Frau. Auch aus dieser Verbindung entwickelte sich eine weit verzweigte Nachkommenschaft. Die wenigen gesunden Nachkommen sind durch weiße Kreise dargestellt.
And those black dots are all the people in the Kallikak family as described in 1912 in Goddard's book as being
Ein einziger erbkranker Ahne hat genügt,
undesirable
eine
or
große
having these
Nachkommenschaft
psychiatric problems.
unglücklich zu machen. Der erbgesunde Zweig der Familie Kallikak hat 493 gesunde Nachkommen. Aus dem Erbkranken gingen 434 erbkranke Unglückliche hervor. Dies ist nur ein Beispiel von vielen Tausenden. In Deutschland allein müssen
And what follows on from this is some sort of shock images of psychiatric wards showing people with obvious disabilities. And this is all part of the normalizations of the laws of encouraging people to think about eugenics and support eugenics as it's happening in just pre-war Germany. So that's the end of that. So, really end on an upbeat note there. I think it's that one particular, I've told a very simplified narrative, a very linear narrative, and I know that history is complex. But the pathway from the rediscovery of Mendelian laws in 1900, the application of that with a sort of almost religious fervor, and the transmission of that into becoming scientifically doctrinal, and then even though it is subsequently shown to be fraudulent and fundamentally incorrect, it makes it into a system where eugenics is realized with genocidal effects. Now, can I have 2 minutes just to wrap up, or shall I stop?
No, what I suggest we do,
Yeah.
we have scheduled at 4:30 a panel session.
Sure.
But I think we'll change that, and what it will do is we'll have questioning to you as part of that panel, because I think you've raised so many points of great interest in so many different areas. it will make a very good foundation for our panel discussion. So you wrap up,
Sure.
we'll go for coffee or whatever it's tea, and then we'll come back and convert the panel session to start off with question and answers from Adam and others, and then we all join in. We've got a couple of hours panel to work with, and people on the webinar are most welcome to join in and send in questions as they have done so far. So thanks, Adam. Wrap up.
Thank you. Oh, do you want me to wrap up as well?
Yeah, you'll wrap up, yes.
Oh, okay, all right. Well, listen, because what I was going to end with was just say something about Fisher. I just wanted to be, absolute, just bring it back to Fisher so we can talk about Fisher in the discussion. I want to make it absolutely clear I'm not associating or applying a sort of guilt by association to bring it back to Fisher, but that is what we're talking about here. And as I said at the beginning, although I don't think Fisher bears any responsibility towards the crimes of the Nazis, he was part of a system, an active part of a system that promoted eugenics. Now, why are we here? We're here to discuss this mathematical genius, the founder of so many branches of science, a scientist who is in the very top tier of unequaled caliber as a scientist. I also think he defended racism and eugenics along the lines of white supremacy. And the question arose yesterday in Alex's talk whether his work on eugenics, when Fisher's work on eugenics, can be separated from his work on evolution. For Pearson, it's unequivocal. For Galton, it's unequivocal. Pearson says it himself as he's handing over the Galton chair in 1933 from him to Fisher. He says, the aim of my science was for this political ideology. I think I agree with Alex Elwood's analysis yesterday that it isn't really possible to separate Fisher's work, particularly in the genetical theory, from his views on eugenics. And we like to pretend that science and politics or science and personalities are these two sort of non-overlapping magisteria, and that in science we seek data which is neutral and is pure. I think honestly, anyone who truly thinks that really hasn't been paying attention for the last 400 years or so, and it's a noble aim, but it's fundamentally untrue. Politics and science are always inextricably intertwined. Wedgwood was another member of that family, and he was one of the key protagonists in preventing forced sterilisation in the Mental Deficiencies Act in 1912. And I think that is a very useful quote at the bottom there. Legislation, he said this in 1912, whilst he was filibustering, legislation for the sake of a scientific creed which in 10 years may be discredited. The eugenics was discredited and has been discredited and is pseudo-scientific. And yet the fervour with which scientists adhered to this idea, I think for me as a scientist, that's troubling. As I say, the scientists didn't create the policy, but they really were wedded to this as an idea. Now, when it comes to the justification of reassessing people from the past or removing the window or whatever, I want to end with a deliberate provocation, because I think that in science we have strived over the last few centuries to diminish personal prejudices and personal politics and biases from our attempts to understand reality. And we have attempted to move away from arguments of authority or doctrine. The Royal Society's motto from 1663 is nullius in verba, take nobody's word for it. And I like the fact that genetics has a pernicious history, but the trajectory of that history is definitely worth celebrating. I also think that scientists often make bad historians. And I don't mean historians of science, they're historians. But I think often when scientists attempt to do history, they don't apply the same scrutiny to historical evidence as they do to their own scientific data. And I think that is a problem. I also think that whilst history in the last few years, in the 20th century, has attempted to move away from the Whiggish great man theory of history, and I think that's positive, and there are historians here who can help me out with that. I think that scientists who do history have sometimes failed to do that. And instead, we have a very great man version of the history of science. And despite, ironically, that we try to remove personalities from our understanding of history. I think it's a rut that we really need to get out of. We talk about honouring our intellectual forebearers as if we're the mafia. I don't think it's useful for science. To understand our history is super important. So I think that the defenestration has served a positive purpose here, not least because we're here discussing it. And I'm pretty sure that everyone has learned something about Fisher and the history of science that they didn't know over the last 48 hours. I had never heard of Edward Colston before they threw his statue into Bristol Harbour, and now we all do. I did know about Galton and Pearson, but not to the depth that I do today as a result of us addressing that history at UCL. And now, indeed, we're teaching a course specifically about that. Putting up a statue is a political act, taking it down is a political act. Its removal is not the erasure of history, it is the making of history. Thank you.